Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's a little after 1, but we're going to get this program started. I'm Jim Maloney, President and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, and on behalf of the entire Chamber team, we are hopeful that you're joining us today feeling safe and healthy, but we know that that can't be the reality. We know that people are stressed, not just about health concerns for themselves and their families, but also concerns about their jobs, their employment, and their businesses, and what is going to be the situation as we get back to work and try to go forward. And with good reason, that stress is perhaps highest in communities of color. And we're going to talk about that today. As we continue to adapt to these unprecedented times, at the Chamber, we're committed to serving as the voice of the region's business community. We're committed to being a source of information for our members and for our community, trying to figure out what's government doing and what are other businesses doing. And we're also committed to being a convener in a place where dialogue like the one we're going to have today can take place. As news about the COVID-19 crisis continues to evolve, both on the medical and on the business side, we have conversations like this that we hope that you'll find useful. We're here today to discuss inequities that can emerge during crisis and what kinds of actions are underway to mitigate the impact of the pandemic and how we can collectively support our region's small and minority business enterprises. Some of you know that in earlier parts of my career, I was involved in building big buildings like the convention center and maintaining and operating infrastructure. And I can tell you one of the lessons I take away from that is that a good storm will tell you where your weaknesses are. And I think we're in an experience in which a crisis like this is showing us where our weaknesses in society may be as well. And that's a topic we want to talk about today. This is a webinar that highlights the efforts of the Chamber's Economic Opportunity Group. And I do want to take this moment to welcome a new member of our team. We did not have the opportunity to have an in-person onboarding of Bea Jimenez, our new Director of Economic Opportunity. So we had to do it virtually. So yeah, let's give a virtual round of applause to Bea for joining the team and for her first Chamber event, which, as I said when I introduced this call, we have over 200 registrants on signed up for this. So great job, Bea, already out of the gate in terms of putting this all together. On the team, she's joined by Casey Baines, who is the Economic Growth Manager for us, and they do a great job within our team, but also within the business community of making sure that no one gets left behind in these conversations. I also want to include a big thank you to today's partners for this event, BECMA, the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, and my friend Sagun Adaway. He has done a great job, not just during this crisis, but over the past couple of years on behalf of Black businesses in Boston and promoting their interest and their growth within our economy. And I also want to give thanks to our other partner, AmplifyLatinX, in Rosario Ubarra Manea, who is also doing a great job on behalf of the Latin community, elevating Latin economic and political power in our region. So we're very pleased to be joined by them for this webinar, and hopefully we'll do a lot more with them. I want to flag for those that are participating that this webinar is being recorded. You'll be able to see it shortly on the Chamber's YouTube space. And also, the format for this is each of our participants will talk for about 5 minutes, and then we'll get into a Q&A session that I will moderate. You can help me by submitting questions, so I don't have to be the one that's thinking them all up. So you can do that by using the chat feature on your screen, or by emailing questions if you're not participating using Zoom technology, to Chamber Programs, all one word, Chamber Programs with an S, at bostonchamber.com. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce our guest today. First is Quincy Miller, President and Vice Chairman of Easton Bank. Quincy spends his time on helping lead the overall strategic direction of Easton Bank. Quincy's career is rooted in consumer banking, where he developed his passion for leading from the front line, ensuring that his perspective is guided by colleagues closest to the customer. I'm also pleased to introduce Malia Lazu. Malia is Executive Vice President and Regional President of Berkshire Bank. Malia works to generate wealth for communities by expanding access to capital and spurring economic growth, especially in communities of color that have traditionally been left behind. At Berkshire Bank, Malia evolved a $13 billion bank strategic focus beyond traditional community banking services to prioritize tangible community impact. Also with us is Juan Morales. You may find me calling him JC during this conversation. Juan Carlos is the founder and managing partner of Surfside Capital Advisors, LLC. Juan Carlos helps businesses design and execute high conviction growth strategies, combining disciplined planning with trajectory changing events. Juan Carlos was appointed by Governor Baker to serve on the board of directors of the Massachusetts Development Corporation, and also serves on the board of the Greater Boston Chamber, as does Malia. I forgot to mention that. We've got 2 board members on the call. And last but not least, we have Gregory Minott. Gregory is managing principal at Dream Collaborative, a full-service architecture firm. Greg ensures that Dream's culture supports and encourages diversity among its staff and consultants to reflect the diversity of the communities that they serve. Greg serves on the board of directors of the Boston Society of Architects, and Dream won the Chamber's Small Business of the Year Award in 2019. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. I do want to remind our audience to submit questions either through the Zoom feature or via email. And we'll start it off. I'll ask each of the panelists to, again, make some remarks, maybe about 5 minutes each. We'll start with Quincy, go to Malia, JC, and then Greg for quick overviews, and then we'll get to Q&A. So Quincy, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jim, and thanks everybody for joining us. I know we're gonna have a lot of questions, so I'm actually gonna try not to take up the whole 5 minutes, but just start with the fact, and you know, first and foremost, I'm with a whole group of friends here where we all work together in our daily lives and all come together in support, particularly of our small businesses and our small businesses of color out there in the greater Boston community. And you know, on behalf of Eastern Bank, and I think I could speak for all of us, we understand the impact that this coronavirus is going to have on all of our businesses, but particularly our small businesses of color who came into this, came into this with less resources, less connections and networks. And those are all things that I know we've all here on the call been working to try to support. And many of the organizations that you've just talked about, Jim, are doing great work there. So I think that's what's most important for us now is how do we make sure that, and Malia and I, so we'll talk in a second, we've just been working on an op-ed to be able to share on this topic, but how do we make sure that we take an equity lens when we are supporting businesses at this time? And so from Eastern Bank's perspective, what I'd say is We are here just like so many banks. The things that we've been focused on is we, early on made a quick $10 million commitment in support of those impacted by COVID, whether that was from our consumer loan fund of $2 million, our small business loan fund that we created for $5 million for businesses impacted, or through our philanthropy, where we really focused on working with the community agencies across our footprint, focusing on food and focusing on small businesses with a particular focus on Black and Latin businesses out there. And in support of the new Business Equity COVID-19 Emergency Fund that is being spun up together with the Boston Foundation and many of those community partners that you just highlighted, Jim. So I'll pause there and really be able to save some time when we get to Q&A and talk about what we're seeing from the bank's perspective in terms of program support, particularly around the PPP program. Jim, I think you're on mute.
Go ahead, Malia. I'm sorry.
Thank you. And thank you. It's great Bea, to have this. I'm sure it feels like a fire hose, but it's wonderful to have you at the chamber at this time. And you and Casey are walking in wonderful shoes with Sheena and Justin. And it's really great to see the chamber, Jim, bravo, to be committing yourself in this way. As Quincy said, I think we as a community bank really understand, similar to Eastern, the importance of us reacting quickly. We're taking applications, we're processing them, we're working on that quickly. And I think, what's starting to settle now for me is, how do we rebuild this, right? Like, we know whether it's Katrina or whether it's something else, that we know communities of color are going to be hit the hardest and are going to take the longest to rebuild. And so I think once we get through the PPP craziness, and it's funny to be a bank doing philanthropy. I didn't know I'd enjoy banking so much, but giving away money has been great. But what is the post? How are we as banks actually acting differently to make sure that we're really giving resources? And I know that Eastern, there's also other models throughout this country that are trying to think about, how do we drive capital so that we're not always on the edge, and when something happens, we're the first ones to fall off. And so it's been an honor to support all of the small businesses that we're supporting. And I hope that in a couple of months, we start having a conversation about how do we ensure rebuilding and rebuilding faster.
Great. Thank you, Malia. JC?
Hi, everybody, and thank you for having me part of this panel. I guess I would say, the U.S. GDP is 35 trillion, and we're about to wipe out, by some estimates, 5 to 7 trillion, right? So that the impact on folks of color, it's real and it's disproportional, right? And it's hard to address the economic crisis before talking about the health crisis, right? They're the big four that have been identified as to why folks of color are being disproportionately affected. I would say population density. We live in urban areas at high poverty level rates. Access to healthcare, number two. Number two, the inability of folks of color to work from home in many instances, right? They have jobs that are not conducive to that environment, right? And higher rates of chronic illnesses around the population, right? So whether you go to London or New York or Louisiana or Chicago, the death rate amongst people of color is the highest, right? So it's hard for me to talk about the economic impact without acknowledging that we have a very serious situation happening if you're Black and brown, right? At Surfside Capital, we have a team of PhDs, CPAs, investment bank, and lawyers. We'll help businesses that are going through this from a crisis management standpoint. And some of the fundamental things that we're seeing in small businesses, particularly in small businesses of color, which is most of our portfolio, right, are how to tap into access to capital, how to tap into capital, and some of the nuances that come with the various programs that are out there, not just the SBA programs, which are the PPP and the EIDL, But you know, the Family First Act and or some of the more local, state level applications, right? So small businesses need a helping hand in planning during an uncertain time, right? And that involves a little bit of dynamic cash flow management, some tough decisions on your run rate, and how do we deal with people issues, right? And we see that day in and day out. And that's all I'm going to say for now, because I really want to get to Quincy's and Malia's part of the presentation. They're going to talk about the PPP nuances, and that is front and center of what we should be talking about today, because you know, to plan long term in the middle of a crisis is a moot point, right? I think it's all about what's going to happen in the next 30, 60, and 90 days, and what Quincy and Malia are going to talk about, and the PPP nuances are a very important topic.
Great. So let's go to Greg.
Thank you, Jim. It's great to be here with all of you today, and I want to just really reiterate and thank the Chamber for this invitation, and for Jim for your leadership, as well as your team, to really address, I mean, I live it every day in terms of being a small minority-owned business, and that, you know, in a lot of ways, small business is the backbone of our economy. I think we all can acknowledge that. Just a little bit about DREAM and the sort of impact this has had on us in particular. As Jim, you mentioned, we're an architectural firm here in the city. We're working on a number of affordable housing projects in Roxbury and other parts of the city, and also part of the teams that are doing some major redevelopment at Winthrop Center in the Financial District, as well as at the Bayside Expo site in Dorchester. Fortunately, we've been able to pivot to work remotely as a team, though some of our projects have been put on hold due to the construction moratorium. And quite frankly, some clients just saying, look, you know, there's too much uncertainty. We're putting the brakes on things as the dust settles. So we've been impacted in that way. And you know, I just want to also shout out to BECMA, who has very quickly came up with a survey which we responded to, and the impacts are clear that you know, 2/3 of businesses in mid-March, minority businesses, had shared that they would be significantly impacted by this crisis, and that's definitely playing out. So today, I want to share how we are leading as a business during this time. It hasn't been perfect as we've been trying to navigate rapid fire changes, but I'm growing through this process as a leader. And I just want to share a few things, speaking to the business leaders out there, and in particular the minority-owned businesses. For me, the help that I really needed very quickly was to create a game plan to work through this situation. And BEI, so the Boston Equity Initiative that is sponsored by Eastern Bank, they reached out to me, you know, very quickly. Glenn Lloyd and Tamika Moss, who leads there. And in less than 24 hours, they were able to help by providing support in terms of HR to figure out how we manage our team, and financial advice as far as, you know, tough decisions we may need to make to sort of work through this crisis. You know, we weren't sure how we were going to try to get through it, but together we were able to come up with a plan, and that was very helpful. The other thing that we've been focused on, like everyone's sharing, is trying to get as much low cost or free money as we can. The PPP, we've applied for it as well as others, while simultaneously reducing our expenses. And we've also been focused on, during this downtime, working on strategic projects internally, knowing the future is uncertain, but regardless, we have to, you know, there's some things, as you mentioned, Jim, a storm exposes some things that you need to work on. And so definitely that's something we're focused on right now. And just, you know, in terms of a business leader with trying to process so much different information, it was really important to me going through this to be able to have a strong inner circle team as I work through a lot of these different decisions. So, you know, my accountant, my operations manager, communications director, they were all, and my co-founder were all part of the leadership team to get through this. I think I'll stop there for now, but I think one of the big thing, before I do, the one thing I would say to the larger business community in this time in particular is that, you know, diversity really matters. And when the pie gets smaller, diversity priorities sometimes fall by the wayside, and we can't let that happen. I think no more than ever, we have to prioritize diversifying our vendors. It's essential to really have a strong, diverse business community so that our economy will rebound quickly. And I think that's what I'll share for now.
Well, that's great. I'm going to come back to many of the things you spoke to, Greg, because you've stimulated some great questions in my head. But I know there's a lot of interest in hearing from our colleagues in the banking community. So I'm going to go to Malia and Quincy with a couple of questions. You know, access to capital, liquidity. I mean, you know, people just want to pay the bills and stay alive right now. Federal government stepped up, state government initially with a loan program, but then federal government stepped up with a big loan program. Talk about the role of banks in this crisis and getting set up to do this. First of all, I mean, Malia, you mentioned going from banking to sort of part philanthropy in this crisis. So talk about that process, how it's gone, and sort of in what ways this is supporting small and minority businesses. Malia, why don't we start with you?
Absolutely, thank you. You know, I mean, I said that tongue in cheek, but there was actually something really interesting about seeing this moment happen. You know, where a bank, as you know, as banks are, we're used to loaning money in the ways we're comfortable loaning. We're used to, you know, not moving so quickly on things, and so it's really been just a Herculean effort for all the banks who have decided to participate. You know, I want to take a moment to talk about banks who have decided to participate, because this is a time for us to get money in the hands of people so that Main Street can be saved. And I'm proud to be working for a bank. I'm proud to be partnering with Quincy on this op-ed and on other things like FBE, to really make sure that as a bank, you know, we're pushing to help people get capital in to their hands. And I think, you know, other banks who have decided not to participate for whatever reasons are fine. But we had a lot of great strides in this CARES Act to protect workers. And in order to do that, we need to get the hands into the money of small businesses so they don't let go of their workers. And I think for us, that was the #1 priority. You know, like Quincy, we've gone through a lot of applications. You know, we're getting approvals. We're now in the process of doing some disbursements. So, you know, we are trying to get money into the hands of people as quickly as possible. I just don't know if the banking culture was the best institution to put a grant program. And so that's my one question. But I think banks understood that we had to take it on. And so we have. And when this is all over, we will all Zoom a drink.
Great. Quincy, follow up. And, you know, I know people most in particular are interested in the PPP program. Talk a little bit about that, how it's gone from the Easton Bank perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think Malia's spot on. This program, and I've stopped trying to use the word unprecedented because I used it 20 times a day as we talked about being able to execute against this. But before I even talk about that, let me just say one quick thing for particularly, again, our businesses of color who are on this line. If you have not applied for the PPP program yet, you have to get out there and do it immediately. And what we hope to do is be able to give you some insight on how to do that, but you have to get into this queue. and I'll give you some context why. And literally, we were talking right before this call started about the $350 billion that was part of this package, and the feeling that banks have had that this money was going to run out. And literally about an hour ago, the top White House economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, came out and said that at the present run rate, that they expect that we're going to be out of the first $350 billion this week. So now many people have asked me that very important question of, okay, Quincy, what does that mean if we're out of the $350 billion? And, my answer has been, and this is, my personal belief, is I do believe that Congress is going to step up again and fund additional money, given the number of businesses that have the demand has been more overwhelming than anybody could have imagined. Maybe we should have imagined it, but I do believe that Congress will step up and get more funds through. But I worry about our businesses of color who have taken time to try to learn it more. It's harder for them to get the documentation required, et cetera. So let me just give a little context around the PPP program for everybody from an Eastern's perspective. So we've been we've been the largest SBA lender in New England for 10 years. And in 10 years through the SBA program, we have generated 6,600 loans. In the first week of this program opening, we had over 7,000 requests. So this is what all the banks are working through, and they're all working through their pipelines now of, for the most part, customers to start, because the Treasury and the SBA recommended that small businesses go to the banks that they work with first, because one of the requirements that banks are supposed to do is a know your customer bank security review of the client. And for existing customers, we already have that information and helps to smooth and speed up the process. So that's why it's really critical to get your applications out there. I think what most banks have gone through is, let's keep in mind, it was just, I think it was the Friday, the 3rd of April, that this program just started. So we're just a little over a week into this. And so what banks have done, to Malia's point, is put together programs and process to be able to handle this volume of applications and work through. And the biggest thing that we're seeing now from our customers and the advice we're giving are a couple things. First and foremost, it is, I'd say 6 out of 10 applications that we see, the customers have all the information that they need and they fly right through the process because the underwriting is streamlined. But the big hang up is this payroll validation and the 2.5 time. What is 2.5 months of payroll? That's the loan amount that you can apply for through the PPP program, and calculating that amount for small businesses in particular has been a challenge. And that's where we mostly get hung up with the other 40%, is making sure that the small businesses have the right information, because the SBA has asked the banks to validate that the documentation is acceptable. And so the 4 quick things I would tell you is, 1, if you have a payroll provider, that's the most effective information, because the payroll providers have all done a great job with providing this information to their small businesses. But I'd also say that's the least common information that we get, because most of our small businesses aren't working with large payroll providers. Second is your quarterly tax filings. Those are very helpful and also provide really great information. And the only thing banks are typically asking to make sure is that they have the employers, as they calculated this, that they've taken out anybody's salary over $100,000. Again, that's a common error that we see. Small businesses not remembering this is only up to salary of $100,000. The third best documentation is QuickBooks. Again, that's self-reported information, but that's the third best. And then the fourth is ultimately everything else: tax returns, P&Ls, W-2s, manual Excel spreadsheets. Many of those things in that fourth bucket are the things that we see our smallest small businesses providing. So if you're providing that information, you have to provide greater context to the banks, so when they get that, they can make sure that the calculations are right. Because of that 40% that I mentioned that we usually go back and forth with the customer, most of the time the customers ask for too much money based on their 2.5 times payroll. And the reason why that's critical is for the loan to be forgiven, to get the forgiveness, you have to spend 7 of the next 8 weeks after receiving your loan, you have to spend 75% of that loan amount on payroll. And if you calculate your payroll incorrectly and you ask for too much money and the bank doesn't catch it or no one catches it, it's going to be hard for you to meet that standard. And that means you're going to be stuck with a loan that you thought was going to be a grant if you executed it correctly. So I can get in a lot more detail later if we want to, but those are some of the things that we're seeing here at Eastern. That would be the advice that I would share.
Can I also just jump on that, because that's a great list that Quincy gave. The other thing that we're seeing, or that I want to suggest, we saw it in the beginning, it's not so much happening now, but people applying to multiple banks. Once a bank locks you in, your money's sort of taken out of the pot, right? And so it's taken by that provider who like claimed you. So if you're applying to different banks hoping that one's going to be able to process first and not, you're actually going to slow your process down. So that's the other thing that we've seen, especially in the beginning where I think people were, we all were thinking that this money was going to fly off the shelves. It still is flying off the shelves, but, so please stick with one bank and apply that way and they'll get your money in or let you know what's happening.
Can I add a couple more nuances, given that we've been helping our clients on this feverishly over the last couple of weeks? This issue around payroll calculation, it's really important, right? There's certain things that, there's certain nuances around what's included in the calculation, what's excluded in the calculation. For example, 1099s, independent contractors should be excluded from the calculation, right? Certain benefits, like retirement benefits, right, should be included in the calculation, right? So the regulations are pretty clear, but there is some nuances and they have to be followed to the T in order for you to get the appropriate average payroll calculation. If you have employees that make over $100,000, there's the cap on that. They need to get capped at $100,000, right? At the end of the day, if you do all, despite of the various exchanges that you're going to have with your SBA lender, if you're eligible to get the loan and the funds are available, you will get the loan. My advice to small businesses is capital without strategy and people means nothing, right? So at the same time that you get your capital secure, start thinking, what am I going to do to turn this company around? What is my people strategy? What is my bridge financing period? And what do I look like at the end of the day? Otherwise, you're just going to have a loan or a grant.
All right, I'm going to come back to that, but a couple of sort of very specific questions. I don't know what this is, but Malia or Quincy, maybe you can help me. The question is, are you using COVIDLoanTracker.com to track PPP and idle application numbers? Do you know what that is? I've not heard of it. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's not something that we're using. We as banks, we enter all of these loans into a system from the SBA called ETRAN, and that gives us that holds the money, as Malia mentioned, from the SBA and gets our customers in the queue. That's what we use to keep track of this.
Okay, another question from the audience. Are you using any formal racial equity lens frameworks in your review of applications? Quincy or Malia?
Well, and I'll let Malia talk. The SBA has given very clear guidance that banks are supposed to handle these applications on a first come, first served basis. And so that's really how all the banks have been handling it. But that's why we're doing things like this, Jim, because I think the larger businesses who got in very quickly and first with perfect data go through the process much smoother. So that, and then the smaller businesses, particularly those of color, don't or haven't applied, and we want to get them into the pipeline and we want to help them so that their applications go through faster.
Yeah, I grew up in a house of 11, and I know that if you didn't get to the kitchen table quickly, there wasn't much food left in the pot. So you got to get your share. Malia, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it just reinforces the historical and structural biases, right, of what we were unrolling, and hopefully because now we're looking more at race and we're using data points as race, we can talk about it for the next tranche that comes in, and really figure out how do we give people who may need more time or may need to file 2019 taxes, how do we help them be able to participate as well. So yeah, as Quincy said, you know, it's first come, first serve. I also think that seeing BECMA, Amplify, Latinx, FBE, you know, and throughout the state, One Berkshire, you know, other folks respond, has given us a pipeline to be able to put a racial and economic justice lens to our work. So that's been very helpful as well.
So another question is about interest rates. How will this COVID-19 situation, is this COVID-19 situation affect interest rates on loans for homes, for cars, student loans? Will it? Has it already? You're both on mute, so.
Yep. So what I would say, well, the Fed very quickly acted and reduced rates. And that had a direct impact on things like home equity lines of credit, for example, that are tied to the prime rate, because the prime rate immediately came down. I think there's, you know, you can see, again, not a direct impact, but it's had an impact on mortgage rates. And you can see mortgage rates, for the most part, at historical lows. It has lower, it also has an impact on credit cards that are tied to prime. If you have a credit card that's prime plus, say, 2%, as the prime rate dropped because of the impact of COVID, that would reduce the interest rate on those credit cards. But if you have a loan that was already, that's not tied to one of those indexes, particularly a prime rate, then it wouldn't have had a direct, immediate impact unless you're doing a new loan or doing refinance.
Jimmy, if I could add a point to that.
Sure.
What we've seen across various SBA lenders, right, that particularly in the mortgage market, that even though the 10-year bill is going down, right, mortgage rates have not gone down as quickly as they should have, largely because SBA lenders have their hands full processing loan applications, right? So they're using interest rates to slow down the volume, right? I do think that they will, particularly in the mortgage market, I think they will go down in the next 2 to 3 weeks. You know, I'm not a mortgage forecaster, but I do think that within 30 days, the PPP spike should be behind us, and folks will be more focused on a more traditional EIDL, which is a more traditionally underwritten program through the SBA, not the SBA lenders.
Okay. One other quick question, then JC, I want to get to strategy, but are banks considering credit scores as part of these loan programs?
No, credit score is not part of this approval process for the PPP program. The SBA emergency disaster loan it's relaxed, but does have different credit criteria that's associated with it. So keep in mind, there's 2 programs. One, you apply directly through the SBA, that's their EIDL loan, and then the other, you come through with banks. But the requirement is really pretty generous on banks for the PPP, the Payment Protection Program. That is only that we verify the identity of the business and the authenticity of the business, that they had payroll, and that the company provides a supporting documentation that shows their 2.5 times calculation. The responsibility is then on the company, and the accountability is on the company to make sure that they spend that money, as I mentioned earlier, 75% towards payroll, and then there's additional 25% you can spend in other categories.
Great.
Just add that other programs, you know, like other programs that we're seeing around the state are also loosening some of those criteria and considerations that they take into place. And, you know, so that's encouraging to see, and hopefully something we can continue to lean into as we move forward.
Great. JC, my question for you is, how did Greg do? I could have ended this call in the first 5 minutes because he laid out the 4-point plan. Come up with this plan, apply for a loan, reduce expenses, get advice from your team. How did Greg do?
I think the only thing I think Greg did great, as he always does. He's a great business leader. The only thing that I would add to that is communication, right? Communication with all your stakeholders, whether they're vendors, creditors, clients, or people, right? The people element of it all makes a lot of sense in times of uncertainty, right? The second point that I would add is, you know, it is the U.S. has seen a crisis every 10 years or so for the last 60 years, right? They come almost every 10 years, right? However, what's different about this one is that it's both an economic and a health crisis at the same time, and the period of uncertainty, it's still up in the air, right? So when you are planning in uncertain times, right, the frequency of planning and the intensity of planning needs to get needs a fair amount of focus, right? So I wouldn't spend too much time about the long-term game here. I really getting your handle on the short term and how assumptions are going to change, right? So a decision 3 weeks ago, raise your hands. You think it was going to be this bad, right? No one thought it was going to be this bad, right? So when we're giving advice to our clients about making changes that affect people or strategy or systems or vendors, I'm like, give yourself optionality. You know, make decisions that are difficult right away, but revisit your assumptions every week because things are moving really fast.
And Greg, you know, I thought your insights were great right out of the gate, but give us a deeper look inside that, come up with a plan. Some people on this call are saying, what do you mean come up with a plan? I need money now. What did you do? What kinds of considerations went into your thought process?
Sure. So just on the first part about the applications, just real quick, if we could add some color to that maybe later on, because we actually went around this calculation for the PPP, the 2.5 times, several which ways, and did it twice, submitted it twice because of conflicting information out there, SBA and so on. So that would be probably incredibly helpful for others on the call as well, just to maybe the chamber could put out a resource there on the calculation. But in terms of the overall game plan, I mean, it as JC is saying, is we need to be able to survive this and be able to be on the other side to, you know, still have a business and people and clients. So the first thing that we did was, again, huddle as the leadership team, and everyone brought a different perspective, whether it be internally focused, how are we going to manage our team? Everyone's anxious about their jobs, what's going to happen. So we had to quickly sort of get that under control. We had to also communicate to our clients to let them know that we're still here, we're still operational, we're still here to meet their needs and be realistic in terms of what, you know, could change, meaning, you know, we may not be able to respond as quickly on this because we're trying to put this fire out. So there's a lot of communication there. But everything was, from our perspective, was done in terms of the values that we have as a company, where we really prioritize our team in terms of how their well-being during this crisis, making sure that they had the tools that they needed to work successfully remotely, and making sure that internally the team was able to stay connected with, we have, you know, different strategies we've employed, you know, virtual coffee breaks every other day so that people could see each other's faces and keep that morale up. Because as much as this is an economic and a health crisis too, there's also a mental health aspect to this that is so critical for teams right now. And so we really out the gate prioritize that. And again, we also, in terms of being able to keep our existing clients connected, or connected to them, and keep, you know, what business was continuing, keep it going, is to convene our clients so that we can stay engaged with them, and together, quite frankly, on each project, come up with a plan. So, because some of the projects went on hold during construction, how do we wind those things down? So we had to really communicate frequently to our clients and come up with a plan that's tailored to each one to be able to keep things going. So, you know, so focusing internally, but also externally, and focusing on the capital piece in terms of getting support that we need to really help us to get through this time where our revenues have been knocked back.
Hey, Jim, the other thing that I would add, thank you for saying that, Greg, is a lot of typically in crisis, a third of the businesses thrive, a third of the businesses survive, and a third of the businesses, small businesses, fail, right? And no one likes to talk about the failure part, right? But the reality is that if you think that your business is not going to survive, right, you should seek counsel sooner rather than later, because there are things you can do to better position yourself on an exit.
Great advice. I think it was mentioned, I'm not sure who said it, but you know, 1099 employees not being eligible, but it opened up the whole line of questions. How does this impact independent contractors working in the gig economy? I'm sure some of you are doing business with such contractors. You can think of, you know, contract employees, artists, musicians. There's a whole kind of list of people in that situation. What's available for them?
Independent contractors are eligible to participate in the PPP as long as they have a Schedule C and earnings, right? Up to $100,000 of their own earnings, right? So they need to apply for the PPP as an employee of one, right? And, you know, their evidence of payroll is their Schedule C, right? I think where you get into problems is if you don't have a Schedule C, if you don't have an earnings history, right? But for the most part, they should tap into the program like everybody else. The other thing that I would say for independent contractors and gig economy participants is that Secretary Acosta is there's going to be a new initiative being rolled out by the Department of Labor to offer unemployment assistance to those that are in the gig economy. It's coming out, I think, this week or next in both Spanish and English.
Okay. Great. So, you know, we could go on all day, but we've only got about 10 minutes left. So, you know, I want to shift to a place where we started, which is, you know, the disproportionate effect on businesses of color and people of color when a crisis like this happens. Now, you're not going to solve racial and racism and economic wealth gaps in the middle of a pandemic. But, you know, what are the calls to action? What are the kinds of things that we can be doing now? And what is on that list of things that as we become more able to, we need to begin to double down on? Who wants to jump in first? JC, you had a good list of the, you know, what causes the disproportionate effect. Access to healthcare, work from home, people of color are more, you know, in that situation.
Yeah.
Let's talk about in the moment and then shift to when we get out of this.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, just speaking from a business community, not from a health crisis standpoint, I mean, this is the time that small businesses need technical assistance. To the extent that you can lend a volunteer hand, I think that would be much appreciated, right? And I think that a lot of folks are getting disproportionately affected. So, you know, this will be a good time to reach over and perhaps deal with folks that do not look the same as you do.
Yeah.
You know.
So if you can provide legal, financial, strategic, marketing, human resources, all of that advice on a pro bono basis, reach out to the chamber and we'll connect you to somebody.
Yeah.
Great advice. Anyone else? Malia, thoughts? I know you have some.
I do. This is being recorded in public though, right? So I'll keep them to myself. No, you know, I think, Jim, you bring up a really good point, which is, can we do this without solving racism? And I'm not sure, so as a person of color talking to minority businesses, I think, we have to figure it out the way we have every other time. And, if you can support businesses, please do. But we knew that if there was going to be something, America, what is it? America coughs, we get the cold, right? And that's been a cycle, and it's going to be a cycle until we actually address the institutional and structural racism that we have. So I think we want to do as much as we can now, but we also don't want to lose sight that the reason why we are here and will continue to be here is because there's two and maybe even more Americas. And, as Greg said, hire minority companies, lean in, stretch yourself at this moment now. To really try to respond to the real needs that people have, not because of problems of their own, but because of the institutional and structural racism.
Great. Quincy, thoughts on that question?
Yeah, again, I think this is a time, as everyone said, where we got to come together. I think the business community needs to continue to step up here. And I think we have to provide education. And there's, one of the questions in here about nonprofits and being able to provide support and advice. And you've talked about some of them already here, Jim, with AmplifyLatinX BECMA, the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, the Boston Foundations and their equity fund, Commonwealth Kitchen. We talked about FBE, the Boston Ujima Project. So there's one of the things we got to make sure that we're doing is for our businesses of color, that we're making sure they know what's in the ecosystem in terms of support. Not, again, whether you have the chamber here to be able to help, but there's a lot of organizations who are very close and have tight knit root communities, and they can help make a difference and support these businesses. And, I just heard on the call today, Mass Growth Capital, MGCC, is doing a lot of work with small businesses, helping them to be able to calculate this 2.5 times payroll. And they're working with their Spanish language employees there for people who don't speak English and aren't sure how to be able to fill it out. So they're translating the application for them. So I think a part of this effort and message is about making sure we know what resources are out there.
Great. Greg, any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been shared, and I would just add that it's just really important also at this time for small businesses to support one another. I know for myself, a lot of the resources that I've received have been from things that I've received from others, things that show up in my inbox with different loan programs or resources I can take advantage of. So, pay it forward when you get those resources, when you tap those incredible resources Quincy just mentioned and others. We'll get through this together if we just continue to support one another in this time. And I would just also say that for the larger businesses, again, if you're considering, leaning in and supporting small minority businesses, that in terms of the way that you engage, it's also critically important in this time. As the pie gets smaller, again, I keep referencing that, but it's true that we need to prioritize paying small business vendors first, right? Just prioritize them because we typically function on smaller margins, smaller cushions, and limited access to credit lines. So when payments get slow, it's a hard knock-on effect. So those are just some additional thoughts there as we continue to.
Great. We've got a couple more questions came in. How does a person's status as a citizen affect their eligibility to be included in a PPP loan application? So if I'm a business and I have people that are working on different status, I guess, is the question. Malia, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll take a crack, and then Quincy, who's been a banker way longer than me. We got to do a podcast, Quincy, the banker and the activist giving advice. No, but from what I understand, If you have differing citizenship, that's fine. If you have a working visa, you're still counted. I feel that it's the undocumented people that will not be counted and will not be able to participate. But Quincy, is there anything else?
No, I gave a plug about the work that Mass Growth Capital is doing out there, and Larry Andrews, who's their president and CEO, is on the panel, and he said, don't forget to remind everybody that non-citizens are eligible. So I trust Larry.
Okay, great. And JC, I think you might have stimulated this question about, the third, and perhaps there's a third of small businesses that, may not survive. And that's a reality. I guess that the question becomes, is there judgment made in the application process of a PPP loan about survivability and viability of a small business? And I guess the second part is, JC, what do you tell people that are kind of might be in that third? So why don't we start with the bank question first? Is there judgment made about viability?
Yeah, I don't want to, I was a banker for 20 years, but I don't want to speak ahead of Mr. Miller or Ms. Malia, right? I would say it's a transaction. If you have documentation and evidence of legal entity structure, you're going to get funded, assuming the funds are there.
Yep, correct.
Yeah.
Not to be confused with the other government program, which is the EIDL, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. That's a more traditionally underwritten program. You're going to have evidence of injury, and there's going to be an underwriter on the other side that's going to have to make a call, right?
Yeah.
That one would be different.
So JC, but what about that person that walks into your office, a restaurant owner who might get some loans, but they may keep the restaurant alive as a business for a little while longer, but
I typically answer that by saying, how was your business doing before the crisis, right? If you have a business that was healthy before the crisis, you probably will have a business that will have a path to recovery, right? But if you have a business that was struggling before the crisis, it would be really hard to survive this crisis. So in that case, you should safeguard some of your liquidity, seek counsel through a proper bankruptcy attorney, because going bankrupt doesn't mean that you're going to liquidate. You might have to reorganize and restructure, right? But it's a much different strategy around how do I reopen the doors. It's a strategy around how do I think about the ongoing viability of this business, right?
Mm-hmm. Great. So I'm going to wrap up in just a minute, but I just wanted to give you all the opportunity to weigh in. Anything missing from this conversation? Or, are there, in your experience now dealing with the loan programs and clients and being a business owner, are there blind spots in the relief effort? Anything that isn't out there yet? Anyone want to weigh in on that?
I just have an observation that was triggered by that, Jim, as well as a question that just came in, right? Quincy alluded to the fact that in order for the loan to be forgiven, you have to use, the proceeds are restricted as to use, right? Subsequent to funding, right? And a lot of people have been let go already, right? So if you're a business that is in fact viable, but you've let go of your people, how are you going to convert that loan into a forbearing loan, right? I think that is a blind spot in the process. And I'm confused. It could be, I might have missed some interpretation around the SBA regulations, right? But it does seem to create a catch-20 if you let go of your employees and you can only use the loan for payroll up to 75%. Am I missing something, Quincy or Malia?
Yeah, no, you're not missing something. When this went through the Senate and Congress, they were very clear of what they approved, that it was really about sustaining payroll to keep individual employees paid through this sort of 8 weeks that they thought, again, they picked the arbitrary numbers, that they thought would help businesses to get through the cycle. So the goal was to do two things. One, to reduce the demands on their cash flow. Now, to your point, JC, if they've let those employees go, they actually have to either apply for less or they have to rehire them back. This question got asked of the SBA, and their answer was, Well, listen, the goal is to keep, so you don't lose those employees. You can keep paying them for 8 weeks. And then with the plan of you now have your staff in place for at the point where hopefully you're able to open back up again. So that was their strategic direction. But you're right, this doesn't address other cash flow issues. This really primarily only addresses payroll, which is usually, 70% of businesses' expenses. But this has to be used for that strategic spend.
Great. So it is 2:02, so I'm going to close it there.
Hey, Jim,
Sure, Quincy.
Sorry, just one more final plug that please, to all the businesses who apply for PPP, that we talked a lot about that forgiveness. Please keep detailed records over the next 8 weeks. After you apply and you get your money, you get 8 weeks on which you have to submit back to the bank to give to the SBA the documentation on how you spent the money. Please keep very detailed records so that you can get that forgiveness on the back end.
Okay.
Yeah, we actually are suggesting that clients can set up a separate account so they're just tracking that PPP money. So you, as Quincy said, do what you need to do so you could just grab it and dump it into the process. So.
Okay. Well, in addition to the questions that were submitted, there was a lot of positive commentary about the information that you all provided. So thank you on behalf of all those listening and on behalf of the Chamber, Quincy, Malia, JC, Greg, you guys did an awesome job. Before I close, I do want to highlight the Chamber's COVID-19 business resource page. You can learn about what's going on in government, updates about some of the things we heard about today, potential additional funding of PPP and then other programs. And we also have some upcoming events. I hope that you'll join in. Tomorrow, Wednesday, April 15th at 1 p.m., we'll hear again from Mayor Marty Walsh. He did a session like this with us a couple of weeks ago that was very informative and well attended. So tune in tomorrow at 1 p.m. for that. The next virtual program dedicated to the Chamber's economic opportunity efforts is Tuesday, April 21st, 1 week from today, also at 1 p.m., where you can join us for a conversation on health disparities in the face of COVID-19. We're also pleased to announce that we are taking nominations for our 2020 Small Business of the Year Award nominations. We didn't feel like that this was time to take off from that, recognizing important businesses that are out there in our community. So if you have a nomination, please submit that. You can learn about these programs, anything else going on at the Chamber at bostonchamber.com. Thank you again to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. Bea Jimenez, great job for your first Chamber event. Glad to have you on board. And there she is. And that concludes today's session. And I'll be signing off. Thank you.